Welcome to the PCI Practical Matters podcast, keeping you up to date on GovCon issues. Today we're talking about 3 areas to question traditional wisdom in government contracting, and today our podcast guests are Tyler Evans and Anna Menzel. Take it away, guys.
Great. Thanks a lot, John. As John said, my name is Tyler Evans. I'm a partner in Steptoe's Government Contracts Group. I've been doing this for a bit over a decade now, focused a lot on life sciences, defense contracting, intellectual property issues, things like that, and excited to be with you all today. And I'll turn it over to Anna.
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Menzel. I'm an associate at Steptoe with Tyler, and like Tyler, my practice also focuses on navigating the complex government contract regimes and helping contractors to identify a variety of different issues, including some of the tricky issues that we're going to discuss today.
Okay. So today we thought it would be fun to kind of walk through areas where I think a lot of people have some conventional wisdom about how things should be and kind of go about their practice, or they're not a lawyer, they just have heard that this is the way things are. And if you really dig into it, I think there's some open questions in government contracting that are fun to explore. So we'll walk through 3 different questions for this entire kind of podcast session. The first is going to deal with commercial products. And the question we'll be asking is, for commercial products, do those need to be sold at least once to the general public in order to be considered commercial? Or can you compare them to another product through, a lot of you might be familiar with the of a type kind of principle that we'll walk through. The second question is, are vendors subcontractors? Is there always an exemption for vendors? Is there a situation where vendors will be subcontractors sometimes? It's a question that comes up often. It's a nuanced area, but some people take pretty aggressive, bright line tests in that area. And I think it's interesting to explore that question. And then the last question that we'll explore in this session is that essentially what happens when the government gets rights in data, gets data rights through a DFARS clause, a FAR clause, something like that, but the data hasn't been delivered. What's the status of the government's rights? Do they have those rights, or are they something that's only triggered later on? We'll talk through kind of some of the traditional wisdom in that area and some reasons to question that. So with that, we'll dive into the first topic. Do commercial products need to be sold at least once to the general public to be considered commercial items, commercial products under the FAR? So Anna, you want to give us a little bit of background just to set the table about what commercial items are, the types of issues that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so what are commercial products and why do they matter? So the reason they matter is that the government prefers to acquire commercial products for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because they get a better price, sometimes because it reduces the cost of the government's R&D, sometimes the commercial marketplace might have cutting edge tech that the government wants. So as part of the reforms in the early 90s, the government made it easier to acquire commercial items. So, for example, FAR Part 12 allows the acquisition procedures for commercial items to be streamlined as compared to non-commercial items. Commercial items are also subject to simplified contracting terms and even data rights that are more favorable to contractors. The key point we want to flag here is that the terminology changed in about 2021. The FAR used to refer to the category of commercial items to include both products and services, but there was a push to kind of distinguish those terms and separate them out. So now we talk about commercial products as a separate category from commercial services. And there's generally 2 criteria that we're talking about when we're referring to commercial products that are of a type. So the FAR Part 2 definition of commercial products includes a variety of subpoints, but the one we're focused on as part of this discussion is the of a type. And so that of a type language generally requires 2 criteria to be met to be found commercial item. The first is that the product needs to be similar to one that is customarily used by the general public and by non-governmental entities. And the second prong is that it typically needs to be sold, licensed, leased, or offered to the general public. So the key issue we're talking about is whether you can satisfy both of these criteria with of a type references, or whether only one of those criteria, the first one, can be satisfied by the of a type language. So Tyler, can you tell us a little bit more about whether the of a type language refers to the sold, licensed, or leased prong, or the offered prong?
Yeah, absolutely, Anna. And so the way I like to think about it, kind of what you just said, is to be a commercial item, and there are all sorts of prongs to this, right? But customary use, people have to be using it out there. and you have to have some kind of sales evidence, right, or offer for sale evidence. Those are the two buckets that we're talking about here. And so as you said, I think everybody agrees that the customary use could be of a type, and that of a type language has a long history, but it's basically a something similar standard. And that can be an aperture that's huge, can be very narrow, depending on the contracting officer or practitioner that you're talking about. You can say that a commercial aircraft is of a type for a jet, right? That kind of thing, or that might be ridiculous to some people. And there's always a debate around that spectrum. But that's the issue that we're talking about, is this kind of how much can you compare to other products? We know you can for the customary use component of commercial items, but what about this sold, licensed, leased, or offered for sale to the general public? You have to have at least one instance of a sale or offer for sale. And Anna, as you were saying, kind of what's the general accepted position on this? If you look at a lot of the authorities, I think the accepted position and what a lot of people will tell you is no, you don't need the product to be sold in the commercial marketplace. So the classic example you'll hear a lot of people talk about is something like a space pen, right? It's a pen that can write in zero gravity environments, right? And so obviously a pen is of a type. It's similar to other pens, but maybe this is the first time that anybody's ever developed some zero gravity pen for the government, right? And you can think of all sorts of examples on computers, aircraft, drones, things like that. And so a lot of people will tell you, and if you look at the resources, that well, the of a type consideration applies to both prongs, right? It's pens are generally used, and that particular pen is similar to other pens that have been sold, offered for sale, leased, things like that. And so if you go through the documents on this, you've got the National Sabinic Report has got some statements about this, essentially saying, yeah, of a type can apply to both prongs. You've got what I think a lot of people rely on, the DoD commercial item guidebook on pricing and commercial items in general. There are two different volumes of that. And that's kind of a Bible for a lot of people in the last couple of years as to how you should evaluate commercial items. And that says, quote, the definition does not require that the exact proposed item be sold or offered for sale to the non-government customer. So the DoD clearly takes the position, no, of a type applies to that. You don't have to have at least one instance of a sale of your space pen in order to be a commercial item, that kind of thing. And you go through other examples. There's, the advisory panel, Section 809, talked about this and took the same position. And even some of the treatises in this area, so the National Sabinic Formation on Government Contracts has some language that says essentially the government could be the first purchaser, right? You don't need to show some prior offers or sales for that commercial status. But I think the question there, you really have to go back to basics. That's what everybody says. But why is that the case? And kind of what do the definitions of commercial items say in this space? So Anna, can you walk through kind of what are the two definitions that would be relevant here if we're trying to answer this question?
Yeah, so I think the first one we're looking at is the regulatory definition, and that's in FAR Part 2.1. And the second is the statutory definition in 41 U.S.C. Section 103. So the key difference between these is really how the definition is structured and the punctuation and separation of the clauses. So both definitions use the same language, so we're not talking about differences in the language. But starting with first, the FAR definition, the of a type language actually appears in the first clause and suggests that it applies to the second clause, the sold, leased, licensed, or offered for sale language. Versus if you go back and look at the statute itself, the primary definition distinguishes between these two prongs. So only the first prong includes the of a type language, which relates to customary use by the general public. And that prong is actually separated by a semicolon from the second prong, which suggests that the of a type language is not actually applicable to the sold, licensed, leased, or offered for sale prong. And that's pretty interesting given the generally accepted assumptions that the of a type language actually refers to both prongs. So Tyler, I know you have thoughts.
Go ahead. Yeah, so I think generally kind of looking at these definitions, it's hard to think about it kind of conceptually without parsing the language meticulously in front of you. But the way to think about it is the FAR definition, I think, in FAR 2.101 starts with of a type and then jumbles everything together, right? So it says a commercial product is something that is of a type, lots of words after that, right? And there's no kind of real clear distinction. There's some, but it kind of is a run-on sentence almost. And so then you have this concept that of a type applies to both customary use and prior sale, offer for sale, that kind of thing. The statutory definition, though, is very clearly the opposite. It just says a commercial product is a product, one, right? And then subsection A, subsection B. In subsection A is that first prong we talked about, customary use, and it says of a type customarily used by the general public. Subsection B has to be a sold, offer for sale, leased, licensed, that kind of thing. So they're clearly separate in the statutory text. And so I think it's definitely an interesting question that clearly the statute would supersede the regulation if there is some kind of ambiguity. The statute seems pretty clear on this point based on statutory principles of construction. And when this issue was raised actually with the FAR Council and some regulatory history in the last couple of years, they just completely punted. They said the statute says what it says, right, and didn't really answer this question. So it's definitely something that, I think I am generally cautious of saying of a type applies to both prongs. But that is something that people have said kind of for quite a long time, that you just don't need to worry about it. Your space pen is good as long as it's a pen. And I think there's a real question, I would say, if you look at the statute versus the regulations, as to whether you have to show that you offered this space pen maybe to SpaceX or some other commercial organization before you really can kind of take the position that it is a commercial product in some way. I think in terms of other examples you could think of, there are all sorts of things out there. Cameras, this comes up all the time. You use a high definition camera and you've made some minor kind of tweaks to it. And we'll talk about modifications here in a second, but it's kind of a newer version of that camera that's military grade, that kind of thing. The statutory definition, if you look at that, suggests that has to be offered for sale or sold. If it's really a government unique product that's being sold for the first time to the government, well, no, it doesn't meet the definition of a commercial product. I think there are some caveats to this kind of issue or question, though. One, not to mislead anybody, we're only talking about commercial products, right? We're not talking about commercial services. Commercial services have that of a type analogy language kind of much more built into the entire definition, not these two separate prongs like product. We're also not talking about modifications. The way people kind of get around some of these issues, and using that camera example, is that, well, we made some minor modifications or modifications that are of a type available in the commercial marketplace. It's got a different type of aperture. It's got a different kind of focus lens, things like that. And that option is available to others, or it's a very minor tweak for the government. And so you can make arguments about modifications as long as you have a base camera, let's say, that's been sold or offered for sale to the government. And you say, well, it's just a tiny tweak from that, or it's evolved. There are arguments in that area. And then I think the last piece is that commercial computer software, this logic and this kind of rationale would apply to civilian agencies, but the Department of Defense actually has a different definition of commercial computer software that seems to essentially directly adopt this position anyways. And so it says, maybe there's some ambiguity with the civilian agencies, but the Department of Defense language includes no of a type consideration for commercial computer software in the DFARS. So it's just another thing to kind of give a caveat here. So with that, that's the end of topic 1.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the PCI Practical Matters podcast. We hope to see you again soon.